Sorry.
It's okay. Hello, welcome to another WLRN live stream. Tonight, I am going to be speaking with Kellie-Jay, also known as the Deprogrammer, and also Amanda Stulman. They were the police liaisons in New York City for the November 14th last tour stop on the Kellie-Jay Standing for Women USA tour. And as many of you WLRN followers know, we've been doing Speakers Corner events in the Midwest ever since Sisters for Sisters on April 23rd. And I've definitely developed an interest in police liaison work since then. So this is a very special night for me to be able to talk to these two women in New York who were in New York City organizing as police liaisons leading up to this event where there were 9 arrests, not on our side, on the other side. The Trantifa activists were arrested by New York City police. And so we're really lucky tonight to be able to talk to these two women, boots on the ground activists, Amanda Stulman and Kellie-Jay. So thank you so much for tuning in to WLRN. And I'm going to just put up a banner here, and also feel free to participate in the comments and ask our guests questions as we go along. I will be paying attention to the comments. But with no further ado, I'm going to have Kellie-Jay introduce herself and talk just a little bit about how she got into feminist activism. And Kellie-Jay, maybe you could also start us off in the discussion about police liaison work and what interested you in that and how you were chosen for that role in New York City. And so I'm going to now bring Kay on. Here we go. And oh, we've got Amanda there too, but here you go, Kellie-Jay. Emily, I need your help.
I think we're good. Can you hear me, Thistle? Hey, Thistle, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hi. Thanks for having me tonight. Your question was kind of multi-pronged, so I'm going to start first just by introducing myself. My name is Kellie-Jay. I am the writer, filmmaker, artist, and activist behind the projects the stopfemaleerasure.com and the Deprogrammer. You might know a little bit about my work already. I expose the intersections of corporate, government, nonprofit collusion driving the transgender rights movement, which I've described as a smokescreen for a massive social engineering and propaganda war being used to facilitate female erasure in language and in law on a worldwide scale. Part of what I do with my work is connect the dots between these normalized practices of child sexualization and proliferation of biopharmaceutical transhumanist technologies, and frame all of these agendas as foundational to the colonization of the female body and female reproductive control. My work is uniquely informed by my past experiences indoctrinating youth with gender identity ideology in New York public schools while working at an LGBT nonprofit that was funded by the New York State Department of Health. So that's kind of my sort of like formal introduction for myself and my work. I started to get involved speaking out around this issue about 5 years ago, started speaking out anonymously online. 4 years ago, I started, well, actually 5 years ago, I started some media projects. And 4 years ago, I began making video content on YouTube under the name The Deprogrammer. I also began speaking out publicly, I believe in 2020. The first thing I started with was the Can I Get a Witness conference organized by Joey Bright. And from there, I just started to get more and more involved. I was one of the core organizers for the Women Picket DC event that brought hundreds of women to Washington, DC, to the National Monument to protest Biden's executive order on gender identity, which basically that order was one in which they tried to change the definition of gender in federal law and policy to include the term gender identity, thereby erasing women's sex-based protections and erasing us as a separate and distinct category from males. That was the first activism that I was involved in around this issue. I've organized several protests at sex role control centers, aka gender clinics. I've also been part of organizing prison protests. I've been part of organizing events around males invading female sports. I went to the NCAAs in Atlanta, Georgia, on the invitation of Beth Stelzer, Save Women's Sports, to protest William Leah Thomas, who was competing as a female. I also organized the first protest against the United Nations at the UN headquarters in Manhattan, because as I'll try to sneak in again later, but the United Nations is engaged in a global agenda, which includes all of their 193 member nation states. They are attempting to push through gender identity ideology at the expense of the female sex, in much the same way that Biden's executive order did, by changing all of the UN's documents retroactively that had the term gender to include gender identity. And that actually came first in 2019. Biden's executive order followed that in 2021. I'll stop there and let maybe Amanda introduce herself.
Yeah, thank you, Kay. I'm having some issues over here, still learning how to do this live stream. I had meant for it to be a split screen just between you and me, but yeah, Amanda, would you introduce yourself and say a little bit about how you got into feminist activism? And then let's start with you then, also talking about how you became police liaison for the Standing for Women last stop in New York City on their tour. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me. My name is Amanda Stulman. I'm the USA Director for Keep Prison Single Sex, which advocates for single-sex housing in prison, same-sex searching, and campaigns for data on crime and justice to be recorded by sex throughout the system. I became involved in on-the-ground activism on issues about gender and single-sex spaces. I guess at the same time that Kellie-Jay did, I was at the Women's Picket event as well, and was part of the organizing group for a very particular area, which was legal review of the written materials that were issued, because that was that event was based on an executive order, which is kind of a weird animal in the legal world. It's a little tricky to talk about it since it's not a law and it's not a regulation. Kind of what is it? What does it mean? So that was actually where I first met Kellie-Jay, and then she was kind enough to invite me to her UN event earlier this year. So we've done several things together. Prior to that, my activism had actually been mostly in New York City in the late 1980s and early 90s on issues about relating to AIDS. And in the early 2000s, I was a legal observer for several events in and around New York City, including the Republican National Convention that happened here, and other political and cultural protests that were occurring. So that's my background in terms of this issue and in terms of the types of events I attended and in what role. For the New York City Standing for Women, Let Women Speak event, honestly, the way I became police liaison was perhaps somewhat of an accident, even though I have in my other experiences had familiarity with that and interacted with police in a variety of roles, which is that at least in New York City, in order to put on an event like there was, requires a number of different types of permits. That's not the case in every state. It's not the case in every city. It is in New York. There are a multitude of permits, and you have to deal with several different city agencies to do that. And one of them is the police department. So I was tasked by the group and somewhat by default being the one physically in New York City to actually wrangle the permits up, which led to my interacting with the police, which will often be the way that if you are involved in this kind of activism, you will first be encountering them, which is trying to work out physically where you'll be, what the parameters are, what kind of sound you're allowed to have, whether you can move down the street or you're stuck in one place. All of those are issues that should be, if you want to be visible and doing this in a way that ensures the police are on board, should be worked out with them in advance. Can't hear you.
I know there was a lot of lead up work, and what I like to talk about is building relationships with specific officers and knowing a little bit about them and them knowing a little bit about you. Were you doing that kind of lead up work in your role as police liaison in New York City?
Yeah, I mean, one of I know we're going to end up talking about sort of, approaches to this kind of more broadly, but I think this informs this part of the discussion, which is my goal in speaking with police as a police liaison for any event or action is to make it easier for them to help you than to not help you. So what you need to do to make that happen depends on the situation. Or it may be to make it easier for them to ignore you if that's what you want to have happen too. There's the flip side of that. But in this case, we wanted them to help us more than not help us. So that does mean building a rapport, explaining what your goals are, highlighting what your concerns are, backing that up with documentation. We were fortunate in some ways of being the last event on the tour. Unfortunate in that it probably had whipped some people up into a frenzy by the time it got to New York, but fortunate in that we had newspaper articles, we had video footage, we had police reports, we had things that we were able to physically turn over to our main contact at the first precinct of the NYPD, who governs this area. We were able to share with them documentation. We didn't seem hysterical. It seemed very, our concerns were rational and were supported. Everyone had homework in that we, in advance of our reaching out to the police, our organizing team had been looking at social media and seeing the accounts that might be interested in what we were doing. And that was all shared with the police as well, who indicated they would be looking at that too. So providing information to make it easy for them to walk into the role of, okay, we may not be so happy that you're here, but you've kind of given us a roadmap of what we need to look at and what we might be expecting. So,
can I ask, did you have sit-down meetings with specific officers or a sergeant or anything like that? Or was it all through email that you were communicating? How did you communicate with the NYPD?
By phone, by email, and in person at the precinct. New York City sound permits go through individual precincts. Each precinct is responsible for issuing a permit in their area. And there's a group within each precinct that does that, which is community affairs. So half the battle, especially in a bureaucracy like New York City, but this will be the case in other large cities as well, is figuring out who do I even need to talk to? Because some municipalities are better than others in terms of having information on their website to give you a roadmap as someone seeking a permit. New York isn't particularly good about that. You just have to keep calling and begging and pleading to be sent to the right person.
Yeah, if I could jump in as a witness to the hoops that Amanda had to jump through to be able to get our permits, it was a lot. It was crazy, especially on a short notice. And as Amanda was pointing out, New York City has very particular terms, unlike other cities. Public space is very hard to come by there. It's all very occupied, in use, and under control. So having those permits was essential to be able to make sure that we could actually have a demonstration without being shut down by the police for not being in the, for doing something in a spot where we weren't allowed to do it. So, yeah, I just want to attest to how hard Amanda worked to get the permits and thank her for that work, and let people know that it's not always as simple as just filling out a little form.
Thank you for that. In most cities, I promise it's easier in most places.
Yeah.
It really is. In most places, it's easier.
Yeah, and in Madison, I'll just say it's very easy to get a permit. And I've developed a relationship with the permit giver who works in the same office as the Capital City Police. I think she's actually considered a part of the Capital City Police Force. Mm-hmm. And she has she, her, hers pronouns in her signature. And she's been so understanding and so nice and amazing. And it's very easy for us to get the permits. And there's a real dialogue and discussion that's starting to happen here in Madison. I'm hopeful that it's happening amongst the different types of police. Are there different types of police in New York City that you talked about going to the precinct? Here in Madison, we have the Capitol Police, we have the University Police, we have the City of Madison Police. Mm-hmm. Was it all just NYPD? Like, which part of the police department were you dealing with exactly?
So pre-event, we were dealing with, well, let me back up, because we had not one plan, not two plans, not three plans, but we had 4 plans about where we wanted to be. And because these permits get issued depending on your location, we were talking with a lot of different people. But if we just settle on where we ended up, that ended up being the first precinct, but also we did have interactions with the municipal police, which are the ones who guard City Hall. Because if you saw video of the event and you saw that nice green park behind us that no one was on except periodically some officers standing there, those officers were municipal officers. So they are detailed to City Hall specifically, which was one of the reasons we had selected that area, that there would be a multitude of police on site no matter what. One thing, and I would say this too, we kept a running tally at some point, and we checked in with each other about who ended up showing up at the event. These are not groups that we checked in with in advance, but if you watch the videos that Kay Yang was taking and Amy Souza and other people were taking, you can see on the backs of different police officers different names, and we count minimum 6 different kinds of units showed up. So there was a counterterrorism unit, there was a strategic I can never remember the name of it.
Strategic Response Group.
Thank you, a strategic response group. At minimum 6. We were
Yeah,
able to
you
get
had
6
mentioned
to
already
things.
the first precinct. Amanda mentioned first precinct. You'd mentioned municipal. You just brought up counterterrorism strategic response group. And then there's also TARU, which is the Technical Assistance Response Unit. And then there was another uniform that said legal on the back that we weren't sure exactly what that meant, but
They really took you seriously. And, you know, was this at an extra cost, like to taxpayers? Did they have to have extra officers on duty that day to do what they did?
Well, here, what we had arranged and understood with the first precinct is that they would have an extra detail from the first precinct on site the morning of. And Kellie-Jay was there a few minutes before I was. I had done a lap of the area in the morning just to make sure that our barricades were on site, and they were. And then I kind of skedaddled out of there to get my signs and things until the group had formed. So I will let Kellie-Jay explain a little bit about how that went. But those groups that we just named were not groups that we had discussions with the first precinct about. Kellie-Jay will explain what it looked like when we first got there, and then I'll just jump ahead here for a moment, which is that they were severely, I'll call it understaffed, at the start of the event, and it became clear that they were calling in more units from throughout the city as the event progressed. And you can see the point at which they had enough people on site to do the things that they had told us they would do from the beginning, which is if someone's using amplified sound and they don't have a permit, and we did for that space, you only get one at a time, that they would be given the boot. That if the protesters ended up essentially having their own protest there because they were so static in front of us that they wouldn't be allowed to do that, they were given a dispersal order, but we were pretty far into the event before that happened. And my take on that is they simply didn't have the personnel to effectuate those orders earlier in the event. There were just too many protesters.
Did you negotiate with them details about what the setup was going to look like that barricade, for example? Was that something that you negotiated with them about, or did they just offer to do that?
So to their credit, in conversations that I had, they were sufficiently, adequately, and appropriately, I'm not going to say spooked, it's NYPD, they've seen a bunch of weird stuff, but they were sufficiently, I'll call it, on alert about what had occurred in other locations, particularly Tacoma and Chicago, just the visual of everyone like right up in the participants' faces and ears with noise. So all of that was shared with them, and to their enormous credit, without even having to ask, they were like, okay, we're going to have barriers, we're going to have an extra police unit. And then we kind of talked about details about that. How many people did we expect would be participating, so they knew how large a barrier area.
You know, I've in looking at some of what Kellie-Jay has said about this, it seems like some of the police officers, some of the police force were resentful of you doing this demonstration because it was a lot of work. They had to like put up a barricade. They had to think about it. They had to be on alert. Did you feel like they were resentful of you, or did you feel like they wanted to help and that they were, wanting to protect citizens in their right to free speech?
So pre-event, I would say they wanted to ensure that public space was under control. And they they were both saying this to me, and I was saying this to them affirmatively, which is, we understand protesters have a right to be there. I was not asking that they clear the space of anyone who didn't like what we had to say. And I was very clear about that we understood that. We understood that people have a right to be there and to say their piece. They don't have a right to use amplified sound. They don't have a right to encroach on our barrier. They don't have a right to set up their own event, because we had the permit for that spot. So I wouldn't say, they're not happy about it. It is a bunch of extra work for them, but they understood we had a right to do it, and that we understood what the protesters had a right to do, and we weren't being unreasonable about that. I do want Kay Yang, though, to weigh in on her, since she was there when the police first got there, and I was not. She had to deal with the kind of cranky on the scene reaction in the moment.
Yeah, and I want to like sort of clarify. I think that the police were angry that they were going to have to deal with a lot of crazy TRAs. And the way that it came out was with some victim blaming language, which I'm not surprised, because that's the general language that's being used in society towards all of us women who speak up around this issue. So it's kind of ingrained now. So I don't think necessarily that the police were mad at us, but they were aware that because we were there was going to be a large counter-protest presence, and that those people were not going to be easy to deal with. So I'll back up a little bit and say, and this goes in tandem with this conversation about police liaisoning, we also, to create the safest event possible, we worked with a private security company. So I contracted a security team of 5 private security, and one of them to be in like a supervisor role to the rest of the security. The supervisor arrived on the site hours before we got there. I was in communication with him via phone calls and text messages. He was scoping out the area and looking for any potential people that might be waiting to set something up to counter protest us. We had the private security team meet our organizing team, sans Amanda. And actually, Amanda and I discussed that maybe next time we would all arrive together, just for safety and for clarity purposes. But what we did this time was we arrived in advance, had the head of the security team meet us at a nearby underground parking garage, walked to the City Hall Park. When I got there, I did not see the officers set up. I saw barricades, but they weren't set up, which is kind of typical for them to have barricades outside that park anyways. So I saw them there, didn't see cops. I saw one officer in a uniform who was posted at the gate of City Hall, which is also normal. There's always a cop there, checking people as they go in and out, because it is a securitized area. So I approached the gate and I approached the uniformed officer, and I saw right away that there were plainclothes officers there that were clearly for our event. I shook hands with them, introduced myself to them, explained that Amanda was on her way, that she is the permit holder. I introduced them to the head of our security team. I let them know right away that if they have any concerns about our group or anything that we're doing or anyone that's part of our group, that they could communicate that to me. And that I would communicate that to our team, and that when Amanda got there, she would fill the same role, so that they knew. I made it very clear to them, we're not here to cause any problems for you guys or make anything more difficult for you. We're here for a fully permitted event, for an exercise of women's free speech. We're here to have women record their voices publicly. Kellie-Jay is making a documentary. We're not here to engage with counter demonstrators, though I know that they will be trying to engage with us. I let them know that our women have all been briefed on how we want them to de-escalate and disengage from protesters as much as possible. And letting the police know right away that we were going to be responsible for the women that we invited to our event immediately gave them a sense of ease, right? They knew that we were going to cooperate and that they wouldn't have to be dealing with two groups of people who were meeting each other with the same level of opposition, because we were not there to oppose the counter protesters. We were there for our mission and our goal, which was to let women speak.
Yeah. And, I think there's some comments that are going on happening right now that I'd like to get to. Somebody said, Carrie Bruss said, the police are there not to protect citizens. They're there to protect private property, which I think is sort of a leftist view and take on the police. But at the same time, they are there it's their job to protect us. And so I think it's really important to form that rapport and that relationship. And the way that you two women did that leading up to this event made all the difference. You were completely different than the TRAs. You weren't up in their faces demanding things and treating them like they were, these horrible people or whatever. You're not going to, if you treat somebody, whether they're a police officer or whatever role they're in, if you treat them like they're a horrible person, you're not going to get what you need and what you want, So I'm really happy to hear about the lead up and then, how it paid off. I mean, it wasn't perfect protection. Certainly there were gaps and there were women who were assaulted and terrified by this. I think America's learning, right? We're learning what these TRAs are capable of doing and what they're determined to do. And I have to say, that I've seen an escalation in TRA tactics and violence and rhetoric in Madison since April 23rd. Each time we do our, or we attempt to do our Speaker's Corner events, and so we need to form these relationships with police officers, with policymakers, the people who are in power, and get on their good side so that we actually can, as citizens, protect our First Amendment free speech rights and get out on the street and not be, mobbed by all these angry, violent men as we're just trying to state our opinions. Who knew it was going to turn into such a war on the streets like this? I'm so glad that the New York City or the NYPD and all of the different officers that you were dealing with took this seriously, looked into it, did some research on what had happened in other cities. And I think that you had a pretty good result. What do you think? Do you think it was a pretty good result?
I just have to say, I wouldn't say that they necessarily did the research on their own. It was carefully handpicked and fed to them. Like Amanda meticulously wrote up a number of different documents showing them this is what happened in this city. This is what happened in this city. Here are news articles about violence in Tacoma, in Portland, in Seattle. So that was, they didn't necessarily do that research on their own. It was all by Amanda being proactive and making sure that that information got in front of them, which is a big part of what police liaisoning is all about. It's about communicating with the police and establishing a record and a narrative. And I want to back up a little bit to what you were saying about Carrie's comment, where Carrie Bruss said something, where is it here, that the police are
there to protect private property.
Yeah,
and
police don't exist to protect citizens. They exist to protect private property. And I think that is in part true. That is part of why they exist institutionally. Sure. And I don't think it's necessarily like a leftist view. I think it just is the reality of what, of policing, of the institution of police. And that can be true, and it's still true that we need to engage with the police, that we need to establish communication with them, that we need to establish a record, that we should be engaging with respect and not treating the officers like they're a monolith and that every single one is out to get us. Though we do know that corruption runs deep in the police, and that, yes, some police are going to choose to lie. That's not going to be the same for every single cop. And there are a lot of police that are very concerned about this issue of gender identity, not just for their own selves, but for their children. So there is an opportunity as well to be piquing some of these cops. And we actually need cops to understand how violent and dangerous it potentially is for women and girls in a society where we don't have sex-based protections. It's actually important that some of the police understand the danger of it, and want to prevent violence from happening.
Right.
So,
and the more you build up that relationship and that rapport with individual officers, and they know you and they respect you, the better the protection is going to be. I wanted to go to a question from Lise here. She says, were the police justified in not allowing and or escorting Kellie-Jay Keen through the crowd to speak at her own event? Has that ever happened in the history of NYC outdoor speakers events before?
So an answer to this actually ties into the discussion that we were just having in terms of what are they there for? And literally, legally speaking, the Supreme Court has issued several decisions on this, which is that police have a general duty to the public. They do not have a specific legal duty to individuals. So if it explains a lot of behavior that happens at big events, if you think about it in those terms. So this question about were they justified in not escorting her through the crowd, which I would say is the more accurate phrasing there. I know we were given sort of the and/or, but it wasn't that they told her you can't go through. It was a little bit, I assume it was more, at your own peril, we're not going to help you. And one would understand why one would not attempt to do that. But if you look at that encounter and how she has described that encounter, and then you look at the tail end of the event and the footage from Kay Yang and Amy Suzo when they were leaving, you can see that the police were escorting people off the site into the safety of their cars. And if you recall, their goal is to a general duty to the public and not to individuals. Okay, they want the event to be over. They're going to help people make that happen by hightailing it out of there as safely as they can. It is not in their interest to not hasten the end of the event by bringing her in. That is not sort of keeping the peace by bringing Kellie-Jay into the event. She correctly, I think, assessed that it would inflame the crowd. And the police were aware that we had a main speaker who was Kellie-Jay. That was part of the information that we provided to them, so that they were aware of potential concerns. Did that maybe backfire in the sense that they were less likely to assist her? I doubt it. I don't think they would have gone out of their way to try to get anyone into that situation, whereas they would try to get people out of it, because that is helpful to them in ending the event safely.
Yeah, that's really well put, Amanda. And that's another point that people should be aware of. We did negotiate with the police how we would leave and exit. There was actually a point in time where, and I'm a pretty seasoned activist. I've been doing boots on the ground activism and grassroots community organizing for like 20 years around different issues. I started very young, getting involved politically. And some might know, I used to kind of be on the quote other side, and I've been in scenarios like what we witnessed on the other side of the barricade. I've been on that other side. And there was a point in time where I could tell that things were escalating to the point where we needed to start to plan our exit strategy, even though it wasn't our original plan. Originally, we planned to stay there until 4 o'clock and have women giving their speeches. But because, we had to be flexible in the moment, it was very clear that things had gotten so escalated that it was going to be unsafe if we did not start trying to vacate. So there was a moment in time, and it's even on camera, where one of the police that I was liaisoning with, he started walking towards me and I walked towards him at the same time. And I said to him, we need to start planning our exit strategy now. And he was like, yes. So we had the same thought, and the thought was around keeping everyone safe. Right.
Yeah.
And if I could add to that too, a corollary to the police aren't there to provide individual protection for people. That is why it is so important, the efforts that Kellie-Jay went to secure a security company who understood what we wanted from them, was aligned with what our goals are and how we wanted to conduct ourselves. And that was a real task too in a limited period of time, to not just call up like a rent-a-cop,
Right.
to really dig deep into finding a company that we could trust, understood what we wanted, and that they were willing to do that under the terms that we wanted them to do.
Right.
Yeah. And again, it's about building up those relationships and that rapport through time, through phone calls, emails, personal meetings, getting to know the people that are going to protect you.
Yes, and I cast a very wide net when searching for a security team because we were on short notice. So I basically just started going through every personal network I had, and I reached out to trusted women and asked them to go to their personal networks. And there were a lot of different leads. I talked to a lot of different companies, a lot of different guys, but eventually really only one thing panned out. So it was a good thing that I put a lot of feelers out there. And now I do have the connections that I started to make that didn't pan out. I have those to potentially use and tap in as a resource for the next event. So that was actually really helpful, just going through that process. And we also, we learned so much from doing this event and doing it on short notice. And there was a lot of things where it's like, okay, for next time, we know how we can do it better. And we know when we need to start doing this ahead of an event so that things can go smoothly. In terms of just to touch back on, what the police are there to do and stuff, like Amanda said, they're not there for each individual one of us, right? They're there to, one of the things that Carrie said, protect private property. They're there to direct the flow of pedestrian traffic, to make sure that public transportation is accessible, to make sure that there's not a melee out front of the mayor's office that could cause a PR nightmare for the city of New York, which was, again, part of why we chose the location that we did, because we knew that the mayor is not going to want a big, a gathering of peaceful women, grandmothers, mothers, lesbians, women of color, not wanting us to get attacked on the front steps of the city hall, so that was part of our strategy as well. And having the security guards, we were able to then tell the security team, you are here to protect us. You're here to protect us. The police are here to, just deal with the city streets and keep everything as safe as possible, and let the police deal with the counter protesters. So it was good. It created some separation between us and the counter protesters. So it was us, the security, then the police, then the barricade, then the counter protesters.
Yeah, wow. And that all of that could be pulled off with short notice, can we also talk about how what's the future of the Speaker's Corner Let Women Speak events in the United States? Where do we go from here? Because I can tell you that New York City impacted us here in Madison. We had a Speaker's Corner event scheduled for November 20th. We were already going to trick the TRAs because the last time that we had a Speaker's Corner event, we literally could not speak. They were so loud and so threatening. And even though I had told the police and sent them like clips of these men being violent with us, the police were kind of like, well, you can call us and we'll be out there and we'll help you, but we're not going to be putting up a barricade. They weren't going to take any extra steps to make sure that there was space between the TRAs and us. So then the TRAs came on October 16th. Amy Souza was our anchor. And I mean, you both know what it can be like. It's like your plans sometimes just fly out the window because adrenaline starts flowing and you're scared. Like I was scared. I was out front with the camera. Nobody was around me, no police officers, no protection. And they swarm in like a big mob first, and they all come marching together. And so as I saw them coming, I was like, I'm going to just take this camera and go right up onto the Capitol steps with my sisters who were holding the banners and everything. And then they came right up onto the Capitol steps. We called the police. They were there immediately. But it was literally so loud. There was no way that we could give our speeches. And so then this next time around, we were like, oh, we're just going to, have the permit and put up the flyers that say that we're doing our Speaker's Corner because we know that they're always going to show up because that's their MO. And then we're going to be somewhere else. And maybe we'll even just do turf tea time from the luxury of our cozy home, And, so where is all of this going? How can we carve this space out on the streets? Because that is where we belong. That is our town square. We need to take that physical space. But you know what? Women in Madison are tired. We don't want to be facing these guys face to face in the streets. We don't want to get our hands broken like April Morrow got her hand broken.
Right.
So what is the future of this free speech for women, let women speak movement in the United States after you've seen what happened in New York and then comparing it to everything that's led up to that in this country as well? Kellie-Jay, can you talk about that first?
Yes. I mean, I believe that we need to be very creative and flexible with what we're doing. We need to employ a diversity of strategies and tactics. Things are not one size fit all. In some cities, some things work. In other cities, they absolutely do not. One thing that we saw with this tour is we got to see a little insight into what different places in America look like, right? Like America's huge. Going from state to state is like going from country to country in Europe. So we got to see a really good window into how different cities receive this, not just regular people walking by that are hearing the message, but also counter protesters, also police. How did the media respond? We learned a lot from this tour, and I think that that's very important. And yeah, like I said, one of the things that we've learned is like not everything is going to work in every city. And for the speakers corners that they do, the style that they have in the UK, it works for them there. Trying to replicate that in New York City, however, proved to be very difficult. We did not get the same results. And I think personally, moving forward in New York City, we need to be very careful about who we invite to events, because when you have an open public event and you say, come one, come all, then we get put into a situation where in the moment we need to vet people that we've never met before. And then now we're either telling a woman, hey, you can't speak because we don't know you, or letting in someone who's potentially trying to sabotage our work, make us look bad, mess with equipment, whatever. And that actually, I was faced with that situation that day while we were in New York, because there was a woman that wanted to come into the event, and she didn't know anybody. She had her identity concealed. She was being kind of aggressive with TRAs on the outside of the barricade. And she was saying, like, let me in, they're attacking me. And of course, I want to protect a woman from these crazy men, right? At the same time, I'm looking at her and her behavior, and I'm thinking, like, this isn't what we're trying to do here. This is not the energy we're trying to have. And then I did end up letting her into the barricade with us at the risk of sending away a woman who wanted to be included, right? And at this point, I don't think that that woman had good motives joining our group. As I review the footage, I see her and I think, you're doing literally everything that I didn't want done, in terms of how she was engaging with police, how she was engaging with counter protesters, and how she was engaging with women that were part of our event that were vetted. So I'm not bringing this up just to complain. I'm bringing it up because there's a solution for how we can try to mitigate this problem in the future. And it's not just vetting people more ahead of time, though we need to do that, but we need to have people assigned on the inside of our events who their entire role is to engage with people that we don't know and vet them in that moment, keep an eye on them, and make sure they are who they say, who they're panning out to be, who they say they are, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a role that we didn't really have specifically assigned on that day in New York City, and that's something that we can think about next time. So overall, like, what do I see for Let Women Speak, like Speakers Corner events in the US? I see us, again, like I said, getting creative and figuring out what works best and what location for the women that are doing the organizing there. So there's a lot of different variables, and we don't have to do everything cookie cutter. The most important things is that we are keeping women safe, and also that we are providing an outlet for us to be heard. And if we're not being heard with these types of demonstrations because of the, the TRAs showing up and using sirens and whistles and horns and whatever to cover up our voices, well, then maybe we need to think creatively around that and think, where else can we, how else can we host events where we won't be drowned out?
Yeah, exactly. It's funny you said something about having a diversity of tactics and being creative, and that locals should make decisions based on what's locally going on. And I think thinking globally and acting locally in this movement is going to be key, because these men are violent, and each city is going to have its own culture of police and politics and free speech laws. And, I know here in Madison, an emergency siren on a megaphone is considered protected free speech, and I'm interested in working with policymakers in the local government to change that law, and to say that no, emergency sirens can only be played in case of an emergency, and, to somehow get some laws made that actually protects that actually protect real free speech, and not just noise pollution and their interference. And that's something that here in Madison I've discovered by going deeply into my local politics and what's going on and what the laws are here. And I think women should do that in their regions as well. And I love that women in the chat have started talking about different ideas around diversity of tactics. Marcia said something about, well, we can have poetry readings and music shows, and Carrie Bruss said something about don't announce it publicly at all in some cases. You and your friends that you're working with need to get together. And I want to say, getting together in person, like here in Madison recently, we had 9 women who were showing up for a potluck the night before our Speakers Corner event. And we made a decision in person with one another about, are we wanting to go out there and face these TRAs again, knowing that we don't have a barricade between us and them, knowing what had just happened in New York City and that they've been escalating here in Madison. And we made a decision all together that we were going to stay inside, drink tea, and do turf tea time. And it was creative and it was fun, and everyone had a great time, and everyone got to speak who wanted to speak in this virtual town square, you know. So getting creative, meeting in person, digging in locally, and building those relationships locally, I think that's really key to good police liaison work, and also to the future of this movement that we're a part of. Amanda, would you like to say something about this?
So first of all, I think tea time sounds awesome. That's great. I would like to come to that. Yeah, I would echo the sentiment that it needs to be specific to what one is likely to confront, and what it also means if you are having an open event, sort of, you know, not invites, not vetted, security then has to be the first priority, just as an ethical matter, really. And that can end up constraining you in ways that maybe aren't then that effective, or that then means that other interests that you might have, like interacting with the public on a sidewalk, you know, end up not happening. So in those places where it is sort of a group of people who are deciding, like you were describing, Thistle, that the people who were going to be there in the moment face to face got to sort of play that out and tease that out. You all may have said, okay, it's us, we're the group, we're not inviting other people to come. Maybe you would have made a decision, all right, we're tired. This is getting really boring, but we're willing to go out, you know, one more time. We want to try to make our voices heard at this particular location, and having made that decision for yourselves and not for just random women out there, that's fine. Like, knowing what the risks are, you can make that decision for yourself. But when you are opening it up in the way that these events had been, you can't have everything in every place. So you have to be able to figure out how to prioritize that for where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Amanda. I think this is an interesting comment. I think people behave differently when they're behind a barrier. They're being held back, so they're more threatening. You know, I think we saw that with those protesters that had their shirts off. They were like leaning against the banner, and I think it emboldened them. But would they, if the barrier weren't there, would they have felt so emboldened? And I also want to talk about groupthink too, because here in Madison, we had a swarm of TRAs surround us, and they were saying, fuck turfs, and it just got more and more, and they were getting angrier and angrier. And it felt like they were going to be violent, right? And so we went inside the building, and then they dispersed. It was such a bizarre thing to observe. And then later on, one of the women who was with me saw one of them inside of the Memorial Union, the building that we were near, and they were just like, oh, hey, you know, it's like the scene, and also groupthink, and, you know, working yourself into a frenzy in a group also impacts whether violence is going to happen. So could either of you speak about the barrier? And I know in that context, and then I also want to hear the story of how you put the barrier up yourselves.
Sure, I'll start with that part. Like, Amanda had tried her best to negotiate with the police ahead of time that barriers would be very helpful for our situation. And when I arrived on the scene, there were barriers there. They were not up yet, but I discussed with the police how I thought we should have them up, where we would be against the fence and the barricade would be around us, whereas the police had initially suggested to me that we be almost in a pen on, like, in the sidewalk with our backs to the street,
which is crazy.
Yeah, which is crazy. open to the street. So we would have been getting attacked on the other side. It would have been, the barrier would have kind of been pointless. So I'm not sure why they wanted that at first, but as a police liaison, I knew that it was my job to make sure that that did not happen because it wasn't going to be safe for us. So I did my best to explain to him why I thought it would be better to have our backs against the fence. I discussed how there had been a similar event the day before in Philadelphia, and that group had utilized barricades, and that made it a lot safer event for them. I let the police know that it was going to end up being safer for the police as well if they only had one like side to defend versus like trying to police an entire open area. It would have been absolute chaos.
You would have been surrounded.
We also would have had no way of knowing who was with us and who wasn't.
Yeah.
It would have been really dangerous. And I think had that been the case, if we were forced to do it like that, I would have grouped everybody up and come up with a new safety plan. And we would have gotten creative with it if it had to have been like that. There's no way we would have proceeded and not come up with some type of additional safety measure. So there's that. And then on this issue of would they be violent if the barricade wasn't there? So I think some people yes, some people no, right? Like although they were acting in groupthink for certain, there was still to me very clear demarcations between who was who. It's easy to tell that some of the people are far more radicalized and ready to engage in violence and prepared to come there with violence, whereas other people are just sort of like indoctrinated people thinking that they're like helping to shut down a hate rally, and they weren't necessarily as prepared to engage in violence. And some of them were even shocked, I think, when they saw how some of their fellow counter protesters engaged. So yeah, I can tell you right from the beginning. What's that?
I'm sorry, they might have piqued some of their own people.
Yeah, I actually think that is the case. And when we first got there and there was a low police presence, because I had been told there was an incident in Midtown and a lot of the cops who were going to be originally stationed with us had been called away to deal with something else. So there weren't a lot of police at the beginning, and TRAs were kicking the barricade in, and I was like holding it shut. And then there were several instances where they pushed in the barricade and assaulted women. That happened to me where there was an issue with the TRA trying to breach the barricade, got into a scuffle with the police. The entire barricade came in and a wall of TRAs started encroaching upon our space. And I had to immediately start, I actually did have to use my arm to hold people back while I called for our security to come over. And then while that was happening as well, that's when a man reached over and grabbed me by my hair and head and tried to pull me down and then ran away.
Was that man arrested? Was he among the 9?
No, he was not. And I'm kind of annoyed because I kept being like, this man assaulted me. This man assaulted me. It's on film. And this man, he actually threatened me months prior in Manhattan at another event that Jennifer Law put on. It was a panel. This man was outside harassing women, and I was one of the women that he was yelling at. And I had my Stop Female Erasure sign, and he was trying to rip at that, and he tried to push me and also said that he was going to pull my braid and rip the hair out of my head. So he actually threatened that months prior. And then he, on the morning of Monday, 11/14, when we showed up and we're setting up there, I heard him calling out to me, Kate, which isn't my name, but that's what he calls me. And I recognized his voice right away. And he followed through on the threat that he made months prior. So these men are, they will commit violence. They did commit violence. And I think Beatrix did bring up a good point, though, that maybe not all of them would have done that. And I think that that's true. Not all of them would have done that, because as I've reviewed a lot of the footage, I have seen where the barricade did get breached. And then there was like kind of this moment of like, now what?
Yeah,
So
interesting.
a lot of these people were treating this like a game. It's fun and games to them. They're all riled up on the internet and they want to let out their tension in real life, but not enough to possibly get arrested or get in trouble.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they were enjoying tormenting, taunting, harassing, and threatening women. And there was clearly a violent element in that crowd that was engaged in physical violence against women and would have done much more to us had they been allowed to, if the police hadn't been there holding them back.
Wow. And what's going to happen to these 9 people who were arrested? Did the newspapers report on what they were being charged with? And are they being held, or did they have the opportunity to pay some money and then be released?
So I'm not aware of any media that's done follow-up. Right in the day of and the day following, they were reporting on the numbers and saying that they were trying to figure out exactly what people have been charged with. And I have not seen any follow-up to that. But I will say this, New York City right now, they're not being held. Nothing's going to happen to them. They're not going to, it'll get dismissed. Like which is part of the reason, people were understandably lamenting, like, why isn't that person getting arrested and that person getting arrested? But particularly at the start of the event, when the numbers were just so enormous and there were so few cops relative to it, they just couldn't afford to try to attempt to do that, because it isn't one cop who has to do it. It's 3 or 4 who have to wrestle that person to the ground. And then it's 5 or 10 who are around that guy holding off everyone who's trying to de-arrest the person.
Right.
So there was no way that it was impossible. There's no way that
will these arrests go on their record? Will these people have this on their record? Do you know?
I mean, not knowing specifically what they've been charged with, it's difficult to say, but I would just say the nature of things in New York City right now, which has cashless bail and charges getting dropped, even violent charges, I doubt it. I mean, I can't say with any certainty, but I'll just say I doubt it.
Okay, so likely it was just a way for them to control the crowd in the moment, was to have people be handcuffed and taken away. I noticed that the handcuffs were just they were plastic. They were really,
the zip ties. They brought in a ring of zip ties, which also, when they bring in the ring of zip ties, it's almost like it's a threat. It lets people know, hey, we will start arresting you. And I think that's part of the police's strategy as well, to try to keep people from, getting too out of control. Right. They show up, and I know this from being part of protests in New York City for decades. During Occupy, like, they would come with the big ring of zip ties, and that's when people would be like, oh, okay, they're going to start throwing people around and arresting people now. Now, I think they also did some of those arrests on purpose to show the rest of the crowd that was growing in number. There were way more of the crowd than there were of us and of the police and the security. So they wanted to make a show of force, I believe, to the counter protesters to say, hey, we're not messing around. If you keep on trying to broach this area over here, you will get arrested. So I think that was part of their strategy, and it worked. I saw that when arrests were being made, I clearly saw people backing up, being like, oh yeah, I don't want to get arrested. It's all fun and games until there's a real consequence.
They also did a little bit of a parade when they came in with the ties on their hips.
Yeah, they did.
They came across behind us in the City Hall Park, far enough back that you could, like, we weren't blocking them, it was a visual display to let people know that they were there with the zip ties, because otherwise they could have come in from behind the protesters. That would have been the more natural thing.
Yeah.
So that was clearly a, like, we mean business now, boys.
Yeah. So
I have to say, I've never been so relieved to see the police in my life as someone who's been the victim of police violence and excessive force against me. I've never been so grateful to see the cops. I was like, oh, thank God, because there really were some moments there where the tension was so high, the aggression was so high that it was like, if this barricade does come down, at least a handful of these people are going to try to rip us apart, at least.
Yeah, that is scary. And I had that same feeling that day on October 16th. I was so happy when the police came right away, because they were just right up in my face, and there was nothing between me and them. So anyway, their hatred for us and their willingness, some of them, to be violent towards us is astounding.
Mm-hmm.
It's something to behold.
Can I speak on one of these men for a moment? Because he needs to be named. He needs to be named and shamed. Mm-hmm. His name is Anthony Martucci, and he is the man that had no shirt on and curly hair and was hanging over the barricade, smacking his hands together, saying, "I'm a beat your ass, bitch." Threatening multiple women, myself included. He hit me with a tambourine. He attempted to hit me with the tambourine a second time and hit a cop who had put his hand up to deflect him from hitting me. And then he also spit on Gina Hoke 3 times. He also stalked Jim Forat, who is a Stonewall veteran and one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front. He stalked him, harassed him, threatened him, got in his face and called him a fucking faggot. He made threats to I don't know how many women there, and he needs to be named. And I know that women and male allies as well have been on Twitter trying to get Coach to hold him accountable, because he is a model for the Coach brand. And he's also modeled for other big corporations as well, multinational corporations, and worked for the New York City Pride. So I know that apparently it's been said that Coach has dropped him from the brand. That happened earlier today, and I don't even have a full confirmation on that, but that's what's being said.
Well, let's hope that's true.
And we're waiting for a statement from Coach to make sure that's true. But either way, this man, there are other ways that this man still needs to be held accountable. Being dropped from one corporate sponsor is not enough. This man needs to receive consequences in any way possible, because he needs, and it's not just about him. It's about showing the public that if women are violated like this in public, we will use whatever means necessary to defend ourselves, even if that means filing charges against people, whether it means petitioning businesses to drop people from their labels, whether it's just publicly shaming them. We will use anything at our disposal to prevent violent men from from doing violence again in public. And I actually see someone in the comments who I recognize from other chats online, who is saying that she was also assaulted by Anthony Martucci in the past at a different event. And I don't know anything about that, but I'm reaching out to you right now, whoever is in the chat saying this, if you could please email me at the Deprogrammer at protonmail.com to connect with myself and other people who have been assaulted by this man, and see if we can work together to get some accountability.
Yeah, I love that you are employing this tactic. It's absolutely called for. They have targeted us as individuals for years. It's time that we target some of them and make them examples of what could and should happen to you if you are violently threatening and assaulting women in the streets, as we try to exercise our First Amendment free speech.
And he made himself the target. He showed and exposed himself to be a violent male predator. And now we need to make sure that is
there's
not
a
allowed to
consequence.
happen with
Right.
impunity, because we know damn well if it had been any of us and the other way around, we'd be sitting in a jail cell already.
Right. Or fired from our job, you know. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you for pointing that out. And Kay-Yang, if you create some kind of campaign, WLRN would love to promote that on our social media, you know, whether it's a poster or a petition or something.
Yeah, I was just
this
talking
particular
with
man, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for that, Thistle. I was actually just speaking with Gina Hoke earlier, and you know, she is still experiencing aggressive targeting in her hometown of Denver from the local Antifa there. She's been her and her family have been stalked, threatened, and harassed. It's very serious situation. It's not a joke whatsoever. And Gina was one of the women who was assaulted by Anthony Martucci as well. And we just discussed, what can we do to get women engaged? Because women want to help right now. Women saw the violence that occurred in New York from home. They're hurt, they're sad, they're angry for us, not just for us, for themselves, knowing that this could have been them. It could have been any of the women who speak out about this. It could have been them that day in New York. So we talked about trying to come up with a list of ways that women can be proactive around this issue. And we're going to try to get something public in the next week or so that women can be putting their frustration to a focused place, you know, instead of us all just complaining endlessly online. Let's do something with that.
Yeah, my understanding is this commenter is saying that Gina Hoke is raising money to go back to New York to file a police report against Anthony Martucci. And Christina Goki is running that campaign. She has a YouTube channel called Turfing It Up. Yes. She was a guest host on WLRN for the Philadelphia Let Women Speak event. So get in touch with Turfing It Up to learn more about that Gina Hoke fundraiser. I was able to donate to it. And yeah, thank you for bringing this to our attention, Kay-Yang. And we need to figure out a way to rally the troops to get to have, women are so angry. They saw what happened in New York, and we need to funnel that energy into some kind of campaign that gets results. So I feel like
we need to be careful as well. We need to be careful and not be reactionary right now. We are playing a game of chess. I want to remind all the women that this is much bigger than there's a grand game at play. There's a long game at play, and we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to operate in a way in which we're not being reactionary and we're not just acting from a place of desperation or fear or we need to think, and we need to pause, and we need to reflect on what we've seen happening. And we need to be, again, I'm going to keep saying this, we need to be strategic, and we need to be creative about how we're going to respond to this, because right now we're being scrutinized from all different angles, not just us as individuals, but just us women who are going out and speaking in the public sphere. We're being scrutinized from the mainstream media. We're being scrutinized from our opponents on the other side. We're being scrutinized from people who would be our allies, but aren't sure about what's going on yet. We're being scrutinized by people who say that they're our allies and do nothing but pick apart every little thing women do. You know, we're being scrutinized. We're under the microscope. So we need to be very careful about the moves that we make. I could say more about that and maybe a different conversation, but I think we really need to be careful right now about the actions that we're taking and how we're planning and coordinating actions on the street, not just to be careful for our safety, but again, be careful because the spin factor is high. Right. The media is working in concert to make sure that the truth about the actions that we're doing doesn't come out.
Right. And so we're not sitting real pretty in society right now. even though we're the fairer sex or whatever. Yeah, we've been demonized, and this is an incredibly serious chess game that's happening. And again, I just want to emphasize that building relationships in real life with the women who are in your local community, and also building relationships with the police and your local policymakers, I think helps build that rapport and that security and that civil society where we are thoughtful, we are creative, we are not just reacting. And so get together with your sisters in your local communities. Talk about different roles that you can play, that different women can play. Get your creative juices flowing. If you don't want to be out in the streets fighting with TRAs, you don't have to be, and still you can have your voice heard in creative ways. I mean, the ladies back in the 70s with all their creative protests with costumes, and we can do flash mobs, we can do music. There's so many things that we can do. So I wanted to wrap up our discussion and with either of you or both of you talking about how the event ended. What did you see? How did it wind down? How were the women? How did you leave the scene? And then what did you do afterwards? Did you meet up at a restaurant? Did you meet up the next day? So I want to hear that story. And then I'd like you to just give your parting words about this police liaison discussion that we've had tonight. So Amanda, would you like to go first?
I will start with my exit, which was different than most people, and goes back to the question, I think, about were people acting differently because there was a mob and there was a barrier, which is
oh, right. And now I remember how you left.
Which is, I had cause to leave the barrier at one point during the event, and I realized nobody was paying any attention, that I could just sort of walk out and walk back in without anybody noticing. So I had a safe place to go nearby so as to not take up a space in the cars that will be the center of Kellie-Jay's story of how they left. I left on my own, and again, same thing. It was just the crowd was so sort of myopic and so laser focused on the barrier that I just walked out, and no one followed me. But I will say the police did. It's crazy. I will say though, the police did say they had police. They had officers at every corner going up and down Broadway for, I can't remember if it was 3 blocks or 4 blocks that they said. And they had actually closed the closest subway station, and then had officers at the subway stations along there. So I just walked out. Was how I left. And then I will turn the story over to Kellie-Jay because hers is much more dramatic.
Yeah, the rest of us didn't quite get out that easily. I had mentioned earlier in this conversation that there was a point where there was really high tensions, and I was like, uh-oh, things aren't going to go well if we stay, if we try to stay as long as we wanted to. Though I will say I did negotiate with the police for us to stay there longer than they wanted us to, because they wanted us to move along like very soon after the whole thing started and all the counter protesters got there. They were like, okay, are you guys done yet? Like, let's go. Let's get this thing over with. We got to settle down this whole thing. And I was like, oh, we're waiting for our main speaker to get here. Thank you for your patience. We're just, we're trying to locate her now and get her here safely. And, whatever I could say to them to keep them kind of off our backs. And because I think they must have said to me before I thought it was before I personally decided it was dangerous and we needed to start leaving, they said to me, I don't know, a dozen times, all right, you got to start moving your people out of here. And I was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, we will. I'm working on a plan. But then I did actually say, okay, we need to have a plan. So the plan was to move women out of the location, have groups of 3 or 4 walk out together, assisted by private security and NYPD, to get them out away from the immediate location, get them in a car, whether it was a car that they came in or a car that they called, get them in the car and go literally anywhere, go anywhere away from the site of danger, regroup, and then figure out how each of you as individuals is getting home after that. But the most important thing was to like start moving people out. So we did do that. We tried to thin out the group as much as possible and get people moved out before we did the like main exodus with all of our equipment and all of our people in the security team. Once that like exodus began, it was crazy right away.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as the barricades opened, they started to, meaning the opposition, started to, scream at us, like get in our faces, try to make us feel very physically threatened and intimidated. Whereas previously we had the ability to keep some space from them. We didn't have that after the barricades were removed, though we did have police standing there, but this is New York City. You think people give a shit that the police are standing there? No, they don't care. They don't care they're on camera and stuff. They were still like reaching in between the cops to like put their hands on our faces and like, they didn't care. They weren't concerned at all. And the police were kind of just like, oh my God, what's going on? Let's just like get this thing over with. What did I walk into today? So as we started leaving, everyone was kind of paired up. And there was a group of Black Bloc and Antifa. They're not Antifa. I don't care how many times I have to say this. These people are not anti-fascist. They are fascists. They are authoritarian in nature. So these quote unquote Antifa people and all Black Bloc, which I don't know if people know what Black Bloc is, but it's basically when you're dressed head to toe in black with your identity concealed so that if you commit a crime or violence against someone, no one's going to know who you are. That's part of why the tactic is used. The tactic is used for other things too. It's not always a bad thing, I just want to say. But a group of them tried to surround me and get me separated from the rest of the group. Because all day long they had been calling to me from the other side of the barrier, saying my name and saying like, you're a traitor, bitch, you better watch out, like we're gonna get you, and I'm like, anyways, like ignoring them. And so yeah, they tried to circle me and try to pull me away from the group, but other women were cognizant of what was going on and they helped to keep me moving and not get completely surrounded. And it's all on film, so you can see that they attempt to do this multiple times. And other women were screamed at, called names. This is when Jim Forat had Anthony Martucci got in Jim Forat's face. Now Jim is 81 years old. And this guy, Anthony, was screaming at him, go home. And Jim saying, well, I am home. I live here. And he's saying, oh, you look like you belong in a casket. And poor Jim is just like, no, I don't. It's just a horrible example of elder abuse and homophobia. It was horrible. And, and just all the women, it was like we were walking through a gauntlet of hate. That's the best way to describe it. Just a gauntlet of hate. And Amy and Ayana were kind of leading the charge in the front, and they got confronted with a lot of the worst of it as well. And then when we got to the parking garage, again, there was lines of NYPD walking us there to make sure that nothing popped off like it very easily could have. Because at this point, the people that were left were the most aggressive and hostile people. Everybody else has kind of went on their way by now, but the ones that were the most violent and the most hateful towards us, they of course stayed all the way till the end. They wanted to see where we were going. I know they wanted to try to attempt to identify our vehicles and stuff like that. And then when we got to the parking garage, everyone went inside. And then again, these like black bloc people got in front of me and tried to prevent me from going into the garage. And there was sort of like a standoff between them and the police and the security, where it was kind of like, okay, like what's gonna go on? And they're screaming and threatening me. And one of the independent media people kind of put a camera in one of the Antifa guys' faces, and they don't like that because they don't want to be identified, of course. So as soon as that happened, they were distracted for a minute, and I used that moment to run past them into safety. And that was kind of how it ended. When we were leaving, we were chased in my car a little bit, and Eli Ehrlich, who is an accused rapist, a serial predator, and a child groomer extraordinaire, who is the founder of the Trans Student Education Resources. He came up to my car and threw a glitter bomb at us. And I was like, okay, cool. I love glitter. Like, that's fine. He later took to Twitter to brag about how he and his crew had abused women, how they threw things at us, how they shoved us, spit at us. They were very happy about it. He also specifically said that he threw a pie at me, which didn't happen. But they named me as having been assaulted by them. And then they also named me as saying that I assaulted several trans women, which obviously did not happen. And if it did, they would probably be playing it over and over again. So that's kind of how it ended, in as much chaos as it was throughout the whole thing. And
Did you all meet up at a restaurant afterward?
I'll pass that to Amanda.
We did. I'm not going to name it because they were
Right.
lovely.
Yes.
And it was because we weren't quite certain how this thing was going to end and where people were going to depart. It was a little bit of a whole other event to organize to get people there. But yes, it is lovely to do that, even if it's just to kind of debrief a little bit and
decompress.
Decompress. And,
yeah, we needed it.
And make sure you didn't just imagine how you spent the last 3 hours, that it wasn't all a horrible dream. So that was great.
Yeah, and to build that sisterhood. So, well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming on to WLRN's airwaves this evening. Do you have any parting comments? We've got 38 women watching right now. There's a Karen Davies live stream going at the same time as this one. I've been seeing in the chat that, you know, there's a little bit of a competition. But this is a very important discussion for us, I think, to have in terms of boots on the ground activism. Where are we going now?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you strategize and work with your sisters and other feminist activists in your local communities? So parting words, Kay Yang, before we go for the evening.
Yeah, I'll just say, well, one thing I can tell you is that I am reaching out to Karen Davis to see if her and I can connect around a man who has harassed both of us, who was also at the event and assaulted me by pulling my hair. So we're going to connect over that, and also potentially connect about for a future protest, because Karen is in the New York City area. So I know that we met a lot of people at that event, a lot of people that had already been involved, but also new people. And we kind of strengthened and reinvigorated ourselves to say, okay, we have people, we can do more things, and people want to do more things. You would think maybe that like women were all like scared away after that, but actually the overwhelming response from women was like, we need to keep going. Like the fact that we got this type of response shows that, you know, we're doing something right, and they're very upset that we're doing this, so we should be doing more of it, or, you know, just keep the pressure up. So I'll say that we have so much more to connect after this. And yeah, and like Pinwheel Alex is saying down in Miami, like after this event, so many of us are connected in ways that we were not connected before. So that's really powerful and exciting to see where all of that goes. And I just want us to continue to be open to collaboration and working together respectfully across our differences, knowing that we're all coming to this from different places. We have different focuses, different experiences, different demographics, and knowing that that's the case, but also putting the goal of defending women and children and fighting back against the colonization of the female sex, putting that above everything else and keeping that our focus, I think is going to be very, very important. And then one last thing just about police liaisoning in general. I think it's a very important thing to do, and it should always be done, whether you hate the police or not, whether you love the police. I don't care your thoughts about the police. You need to establish communication with them when you're having a public event like this. It's for your safety and it's for the safety of the public, because the last thing we want to do is wrap up like members of the public who have no idea what are going on. They're on their lunch break or they're walking their kids to an appointment or something, and suddenly they get caught up in something. That would be terrible for us, and it's unethical that we so working with the police is important when you're doing these types of open public demonstrations. And it's also important it's how we start to establish our narrative and keep a record of what happened. So now, no matter how much the news lies, how many different media outlets lie, we have an established official record that says the truth about, that we were fully permitted to be there, that we had negotiated with the police ahead of time. We did everything above the board, and that helps our cause and it helps us defend ourselves against accusations, right?
Yes,
So
thank you so much, Kay Yang, and for providing such a detailed account of the lead up and then the execution of the event in New York City. It's just been so useful for me to be taking notes and comparing what we're doing here in Madison. So thank you so much. Amanda, your parting words?
So I would end by saying this, which is you have a right to do this. The police cannot stop you from doing this. They can make it easier or harder. And where you live may make it easier or harder. But you have a right to do this, and if you want to do it, hopefully you can learn from other people about how to make it less complicated and challenging for yourself. But it's for you to do if that's what you want.
All right, ladies, thanks again. And thanks to our audience online for tuning in to WLRN. We will be lifting excerpts from this live stream for our monthly podcast produced by Jenna DeQuarto that's coming out on December 1st. Amy Souza will also be featured in that podcast and a later longer interview with her and Elizabeth Miller, who is volunteering for WLRN. So look for that podcast coming out on December 1st and every first Thursday of the month. Have a great night, ladies. Thank you so much.
Thistle, thank you so much for having us and all the work that WLRN does to raise the voices of women and make us heard. Thank you.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.